Everyone's seen the base performance of the RX 7900 XT, but with FSR and now AMD's Fluid Motion Frames available on nearly every single game, what kind of FPS is possible with the 7900 XT now that wasn't available at launch? Well, I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you how to turn on FSR Fluid Motion Frames in almost any game.
I'll be using my trusty Sapphire Pulse to explore the extreme performance available to a 7900 XT owners. So how am I going to do it?
Well, all settings we set to Ultra with ray tracing turned on, so we're working from max visual quality. Then we'll have all resolutions render as close to 1080p as possible. This means 1440p monitor will be rendering with quality settings FSR, 1600p with balance, and 2160p with performance. This will give a roughly equivalent visual quality for all three resolutions, and lines up quite nicely with what AAA developers are recommending you use on all their new releases. Then we'll apply AMD's Fluid Motion Frames, whether that's through the driver or in native game support, which I'll show you how to do both.
I have 9 games, 3 of which have in-game AMD Fluid Motion Frames support, and 6 of which use the driver version, which has limitations in some game types, but can be easily turned on in most games. In order to use driver-based AMD Fluid Motion Frames, check to see if the game is in your Adrenaline Software games list. Some brand new games like Hellblade 2 are not yet supported, while older games that never had FSR or even any form of upscaling are often supported. Then once the game is running, hit Alt-R to bring up the overlay and click on the Fluid Motion Frames toggle. When it turns on, you will see a green check next to the toggle if it is working properly. If you see no green check, it is likely not working. You will need to be playing in full screen mode, and the only way you can check if the extra frames are being generated is with the AMD Overlay Performance Metrics. Third-party frame monitoring tools can't detect the driver-generated frames, like they can in the versions that are built into the game. There is one bigger downside of the driver version. The way it is implemented, it stops producing generated frames on fast camera movement. As you can see, the base frame rate never wavers with fast camera movement, while the generated frames drop to the base frame rate when it happens, killing the perceived smoothness of the play experience. This is working as intended, but I still much prefer the in-game version that never drops frames, no matter how fast you're moving the camera. Due to this behavior, and because my standard benchmarking apps can't record the frame gen on the driver side, I can only double the recorded base frame rate, which is accurate for games like Diablo 4, and accurate to the benchmark I run in Fortnite because it's a replay and doesn't experience the dips you would see in actual gameplay, but it won't be fully accurate to the play experience of first and third person games.
With all that out of the way, I'll flash the specs of my test system for you. If you want to take them in, just pause the video. Now, let's get into those results.
Starting off, we will look at Fortnite with epic settings, 100% resolution scale with nanite lumen and hardware RT on. Even the lowest resolution, 1440p Ultrawide, struggles to stay in acceptable frame rates with this heavy workload, with the next 2 higher resolutions barely playable, and the 2160p Ultrawide with an unacceptable performance. But once we apply our upscaling settings, we see that the 1440p and 1600p Ultrawides jump up to smooth gameplay, and the 2 higher resolutions manage acceptable. And when AMD Fluid Motion Frames are activated, we see the 2 lower resolutions get very high refresh rates, and the higher ones achieve high refresh rates. All resolutions see a huge gains in playability and smoothness when the tech is leveraged, while maintaining a standard of visual quality better than you could get by lowering the settings to match the performance. Though I would not use AMD Fluid Motion Frames for competitive play, thanks to the additional latency it adds.
Next up is Starfield on Ultra settings, no upscaling. This is our first natively implemented AMD Fluid Motion Frames game. The 7900 XT delivers a smooth gameplay experience with both the 1440p and 1600p ultra-wide resolutions, and manages acceptable performance at 1440p super ultra-wide resolutions, but not so much at 2160p ultra-wide resolutions. Turning on upscaling moves everything up a performance tier or 2, and the XT now delivers high refresh rates at 2 of the resolutions and smooth refresh rates for the other 2. Turning on Fluid Motion Frames, which is in-game here, catapults everything to very high refresh rate range. If you have a monitor with high enough refresh rate, I don't see any reason not to use AFMF in this game if you want more smoothness. Next is Cyberpunk, using its Ultra RT preset with upscaling turned off. Cyberpunk's ray tracing has always been hard on AMD cards, and the 7900 XT is no different, with it not even getting 30 FPS at any resolution. Once FSR is turned on, both the 1440p and 1600p Ultrawides make it to acceptable range, while the two higher resolutions manage to clear 30. Turning on fluid motion frames, see the 7900 XT achieve high refresh rates at 1440p and 1600p, and smooth refresh rates for the two higher resolutions. A huge performance improvement, taking the cards from completely unacceptable performance to high refresh rates. The 1440p and 1600p ultrawide latency will be fine for play, but the super ultrawide and the 2160p ultrawide will feel slow to react and may cause frustration. Next up is Star Wars Jedi Survivor, played on its epic preset with RT and upscaling off. The 700 XT achieves acceptable performance at 1440p and 1600p, but falls out of desirable range for the super ultrawide and 2160p resolutions. Turning on FSR upscaling, the 7900 XT gets all four resolutions above the smooth 60 FPS line. Once AMD Fluid Motion Frames is turned on, we see all resolutions either in very high refresh rates or high refresh rates. The 7900 XT is able to provide a responsive gaming experience at all resolutions with AMD Fluid Motion Frames enabled, making for a silky smooth presentation. Next up is Immortals of Aveum on its Ultra preset. The 7900 XT can achieve over 60 FPS at 1440p ultrawide, but the 1600p and the super ultrawide are just getting acceptable performance, while the 2160p ultrawide is barely above 30 FPS. Using FSR upscaling, the XT gets all resolutions above 60 FPS into smooth gameplay range. And when the in-game AMD Fluid Motion Frames are used, 1440p ultrawide, the 1600p ultrawide, and the super ultrawide are all in very high refresh rate range, with the 2160p ultrawide with high refresh rates hanging around the 120 FPS mark. With the 7900 XT able to get all resolutions to a nice smooth refresh rate with FSR, you can leverage AMD Fluid Motion Frames safely without feeling any of the latency side effects to max out your monitor's refresh rate. Next up is F1 2023, played on ultra high preset that includes ray tracing with upscaling turned off. The 7900 XT is able to get smooth frame rates for both 1440p and 1600p ultrawide resolutions straight out the gate, but the super ultrawide resolution is seeing an acceptable performance, while the 2160p ultrawide is getting unsatisfactory performance. Turning on FSR upscaling, however, allows the XT to deliver 3 high refresh rate gaming experience and 1 smooth one. And turning on AMD Fluid Motion Frames takes smoothness to ridiculous levels, with the 1440p and 1600p ultrawide resolutions running over 200 FPS, while the super ultrawide and 2160p ultrawides are seeing very high refresh rates. Here you can see there's plenty of performance still available to the 7900 XT if you're willing to use some of its features. Next up is Diablo 4, played on Ultra Ray Tracing preset with no upscaling. Here we see the 7900 XT able to get smooth FPS at both 1440p and 1600p ultrawide resolutions, with the super ultrawide barely falling short of joining them. The 2160p ultrawide, however, is well below acceptable frame rates. Turning on FSR brings all resolutions into the smooth frame rate range, making them all perfect candidates for turning on AMD Fluid Motion Frames, which allows the 7900 XT to deliver very high refresh rates at all resolutions. Diablo 4 is a perfect candidate for driver-based fluid motion frames because there is no camera movement that could lower the frame rate, and because your character can only move so fast, you never have that much of the screen being replaced at any one time, so it's a nice and easy on the algorithm. Next up is Forspoken, played on its ultra high preset with upscaling turned off. The 7900 XT manages to get 3 of the ultrawide resolutions into the acceptable frame rate zone, with the 2160p ultrawide lagging behind. Turning on FSR upscaling sees all resolution achieve smooth frame rates, putting them in a good position to leverage the native implementation of AMD Fluid Motion Frames, which catapults everything to near or above 120 FPS gameplay. Forspoken is another game where the 7900 XT is able to play smoothly at every resolution with a little FSR application, but you can take the whole smoothness thing to a new level with AMD Fluid Motion Frames. For our last game, we have Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, played on its Ultra preset with Ultra RT turned on and no upscaling. Here the 7900 XT is already getting 2 resolutions over 60 FPS, while the Super Ultrawide is getting acceptable frame rates, and the 2160p Ultrawide is managing to stay above 30. Thanks to the heavy ray tracing burden, FSR is very effective at boosting FPS, and 1440p, 1600p, and 2160p Ultrawides all achieve high refresh rates, with the Super Ultrawide achieving smooth gameplay. So, when flipping the AMD Fluid Motion Frame switch, frame rates go through the roof, with the 1440p and 1600p Ultrawides getting over 200 FPS. and the Super Ultrawide and 2100p Ultrawide, getting well into very high refresh rates. When we examine our final results of all games, we see if you are just going to play at ultra settings plus ray tracing at native resolution, only the 3440 by 1440p Ultrawide would be getting smooth 60 FPS, with both the 3840 by 600p Ultrawide and the 5120 by 1440p Super Ultrawide getting acceptable frame rates, and the 5120 by 2160p Ultrawide struggling at a frame rate barely above 30. Though, if you are willing to upscale from 1080p for each of these resolutions, then you can enjoy a smooth frame rate at every resolution, and putting the 7900 XT in the perfect position to leverage fluid motion frames, which brings every resolution into very high refresh rate range, and should satisfy most smoothness freaks.
The 7900 XT can get a tremendous amount of extra FPS if you're willing to leverage all the features in the AMD ecosystem. But that doesn't mean I would always turn everything up to 11. A lot of the time, just using FSR upscaling to get things to 60 FPS is enough, and I would stay there, especially if you're using an FPS game or a third-person action game that is using the driver-based AMD fluid motion frames. The slowdown when you're doing fast camera movements really bothers me a lot more than just having a lower FPS to it. Though, in-game fluid motion frames almost always looks nice. In a game like Starfield, which has native AMD fluid motion frame support, as long as you're able to get your base FPS over 60 before turning it on, you're going to have an extremely smooth and responsive enough experience for a good PvE gameplay. PvP is another story where there's almost unanimous consent that using any kind of frame generation is going to hurt your experience. The added latency just means that you're more likely to miss your shot or get shot before you can see the person. The 7900 XT, when leveraging the full tool suite of FSR3, is able to play almost any game at any of our resolutions with smooth gameplay, except for the proverbial thorn in Radeon's side, Cyberpunk 2077. The extreme amounts of ray tracing mean that even when rendering at 1080p and upscaling, you can't hit 60 FPS, which puts you outside of the window for using AMD fluid motion frames. While upscaling and frame generation technologies are great for boosting smoothness in games while keeping visual losses to a minimum, they're still losses, and they lock you out of other technologies that go the other way by increasing fidelity, like AMD's FSR native AA, which increases fidelity beyond what most normal AA can do. So, when you're approaching a new game, just make sure you know how you want to play it and the things that are most important to you in that experience. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to stay tuned to the channel to catch the upcoming video version of this video, or you can check out one of my other videos. I'm Scott, and I'll see you next time, Ultrawide fans.